Hello everyone. Uh, Today's video is about the next debt instrument or a debt derivative we can say, which is called as swaps. So this basically it's a very simple instrument or a simple arrangement where they simply exchange their obligations. So in short, they just sing out the favorite Airtel song where they say जो तेरा है वो मेरा है जो मेरा है वो तेरा. So it's on the same line, something they're going to just exchange against each other. So let's quickly take up an example. Let's quickly take up an example to understand what this swap as a instrument is. So let's say we have two entities, A and B. They can borrow from the market at some fixed rate and also at some floating rate. Obviously both the firms will be having different credit rating, so based on that the rate which is offered to them in the market may be different. So let's say A can borrow in the market at a fixed rate of 10%, whereas B can borrow in the market at a fixed rate of, let's say, 12%. A can borrow in the market at, let's say, floating rate of MIBOR plus let's say 2%, whereas B can borrow in the market at MIBOR plus 1%. So if you analyze it a bit, you'll observe that A is having an advantageous position as compared to B as far as fixed rate of interest is concerned, whereas B is having an advantageous position as compared to A as far as floating rate is concerned. Okay. So now suppose if A want a fixed rate, definitely A is going to borrow at 10%, whereas if B wants a floating rate, advantage is there for it, so it will borrow at MIBOR plus 1%. But suppose I say that the required rate required is, let's say A require a floating rate and B require a fixed rate. So now obviously if A itself goes into the market and borrows, then he'll have to shell out an interest of MIBOR plus 2%, whereas if B goes into the market for fixed, it has to shell out 12%. So basically they'll be thinking now what is to be done. So they just met each other, both the firms, and now they are talking to each other, and this table is laid in front of them where they say that A can borrow at 10% or at a floating rate of MIBOR plus 2, same way B rate. Then something clicks for them, and that click is simply A says, hey, listen, you need a fixed rate, so definitely if you borrow you are supposed to pay 12%, but if I borrow I'll pay 10%, and similarly if you borrow under floating you will pay MIBOR plus 1%, whereas my requirement is floating rate. So let's do one thing, you undertake my obligation, I undertake your obligation. So basically A and B are going to take a loan from outside, and that loan will require A to pay 10%. It will require A to pay 10% because A will take a fixed rate. A will take a fixed rate of interest loan under which A is going to pay out 10%, because A was anyways having advantage in fixed rate as compared to B, so it takes a fixed rate, whereas B will say, okay, let me just do one thing, I'll take a floating rate I'll take a floating rate loan. So B will be paying outside MIBOR plus 1%. Okay, but as we know, A wants a floating rate loan, so A doesn't want to undertake this fixed obligation. So A will simply say, whatever is yours, that's mine. I will undertake your obligation, you undertake my obligation. So A says, what is your obligation? So B says that my obligation is MIBOR plus 1%. Okay, so A will say, okay, take this MIBOR plus 1% at regular intervals from me. That is, I'm going to pay your interest. And you do one thing, you pay me my obligation 10%. So essentially, if you look at it, A, it pays 10%. It also pays MIBOR plus 1%, and it receives 10%. So if you'll say the net effect is net payment is MIBOR plus 1%. Whereas as regards B pays out MIBOR plus 1% and also 10%, because B is paying out MIBOR plus 1%, B is paying 10% to A, whereas it receives MIBOR plus 1%. So essentially the net effect is 10%. So they just exchanged their obligation, and by that they're able to save on the rate of interest. Because had A borrowed on its own, it would have been cost MIBOR plus 2%, whereas now the cost for A is MIBOR plus 1%. Whereas for B, it would have been like at a fixed rate, it would have cost him 12%, but right now it is MIBOR plus 1% was exchange, and the net cost is 10%. Okay. So now this is the typical plain vanilla swap that is happening between both the parties, by which they are able to reduce their rate of interest. But can you think that out of these two parties, A and B, which one would be, relatively less happy? Out of A and B, which one would be relatively less happy? You're right, it is going to be A, which is going to be relatively less happy. Why, sir? Why is it going to be less happy? He's not going to be happy because he's not going to be less happy that something has lost his something loss is incurred to A, but rather he's going to be less happy for a fact that B is saving more as compared to me. So if you look at it, I'll just say rate of interest if borrowed on its own. We will say if A would have borrowed a floating rate, it would have cost him MIBOR plus 2%, and B, if he would have borrowed at a floating rate, it would have cost him 12%. So basically, savings, if you look at it, so A will say, I am saving just 1%, and the B guy is saving 2%, and that is the reason why A will be comparatively less happy as compared to B, even though he is saving, but his savings are less than what B is saving. His savings are just 1%, whereas B is saving 2%. So definitely A is going to state that it's really something injustice has been meted out to me. I'm not getting a due share. So now once this arrangement is done, now if you think from the other point of view, that the savings are not equally shared between A and B. Here A is getting 1% and B is getting 2%. Now again, that can be negotiated between each other, where they state that because of a better credit standing of, or powerful position of B will say, I will take a greater share of benefit. So that is definitely possible. But what if they decide to share the benefit equally? So for that purpose, let me just come back over here, and I'll say savings. Let's look at savings. The savings that is going to be in fixed is going to be 2%. If A takes a loan instead of B at a fixed rate, there's going to be 2%, and if B takes a loan at M plus 1%, there's a saving of 1%. So total savings is 3%. And now if this total savings are to be shared equally, so we say A should be getting a portion of 1.5% interest as saved, and B should be getting 1.5% as saved. Okay, so let's consider what could be the rate of interest applicable to them. So we said that total savings over here is 3%, that we observed over here also. We had 2% savings for B and 1% savings for A. The total savings was working out to be 3%. That 3% should be essentially shared between A and B as 1.5%, 1.5%. So I will say, what's the rate of interest if borrowed on its own? At a floating rate, it would have cost him MIBOR plus 2%, because remember his requirement was floating. B would have cost 12%. So cost, or I can say rate of interest after swap, it should be MIBOR plus 0.5%, and on the other side it should be 10.5%. So MIBOR plus 0.5%, and this is 12 minus 1.5%, which is 10.5%. So this should be the rate of interest after swap. This is something which we need to remember. This should be the rate of interest after swap. Now how do we design this? How do we engineer this swap? Let me again just draw up a diagram where A pays outside a 10%, because it would have taken a loan of 10%. B will be paying outside a rate of interest of MIBOR plus 1%. Then they need to exchange the obligation, but we want the rate of interest after swap to be M plus 0.5%, and for B it should be 10.5%. So A will say, hey, listen, we have worked upon this, and we have said that when I convert this fixed to a floating rate, the net effect for me should be MIBOR plus 0.5%. So A will say simply, look Mr. B, or look B Limited, I will pay out my cost to you, which is MIBOR plus 0.5%, which is this one, and you commit my fixed rate of interest. And let me assure you guys, if you follow this method where you fix the rate of interest, which is the net cost for A, as MIBOR plus 0.5%, so A needs to pay MIBOR plus 0.5%, and its 10% interest outflow should be financed by B with this 10%. And you will observe that now, if you consider the payment and receipts, how much does A pay and how much does it receive? So we say A pays 10% and also MIBOR plus 0.5%. It receives 10%. Whereas in case of B, it pays out MIBOR plus 1%. It also pays 10% and it receives MIBOR plus 0.5%. If you take the net effect, the net pay, you will see it is 10% plus MIBOR plus 0.5%. So this 10% gets cancelled. So the cost for A is MIBOR plus 0.5%, which is exactly the same thing which we were talking about. Whereas in case of B, you will find that it pays MIBOR plus 1%, it also pays 10%, it receives MIBOR plus 0.5%. So if you take a net effect of it, that will work out to be 10.5%, and in this way it's just an equitable distribution of the benefit, because as we have seen, if A borrows on its own, then the cost will be MIBOR plus 2%, whereas over here the cost to A is MIBOR plus 0.5%, so A is having a benefit of 1.5%, whereas in case of B, if B would have borrowed, it would have costed 12%, but right now it costs thus 10.5%, so there's a benefit of 1.5% for B even. So this is a way in which swaps are engineered between the entities so that they share the gains equally or in whatever proportion they intend to. Okay, so let's look at one more example where we will bring in a dealer. So let's see, where we bring in a dealer, what happens. Suppose let's take some other name as X and Y. So let's consider a fixed rate of interest and a floating rate of interest. So suppose X can borrow at 8%, Y can borrow at 10%. Floating rate wise, X can borrow at, let's say, MIBOR plus 4%, and Y can borrow at MIBOR plus 1%. So both these people are brought together by a dealer, by a swap dealer, and he is asking for a margin. So there's a swap dealer margin. The swap dealer margin is, let's say, 1%. Swap dealer margin is 1%, and I say that gains to be shared in ratio of, let's say in the ratio of, suppose 3:1, that is a major chunk of savings is to be taken over by X. This is the agreed thing. So how do we create a swap for it? How do we engineer a swap between them? Because there is going to be also a dealer in between. So for that, just remember this method that we did. We just did the total, the savings total, and then shared it between equally, right? And then we determined what should be the rate of interest after swap. Let's do it by the same method. So if I ask you, what are the savings due to swap? So you'll simply say that this is 2% savings and this is 3% savings, because here the difference, or I can say X is having an advantageous position 8%, so 2% gain. Y is having an advantageous position of 3%, so because X takes it as M plus 4%, Y can borrow it at M plus 1%, so there's a gain of 3%. Okay, so now savings due to swap, if I consider, that's going to be 2% plus 3%, so basically there's a gain of 5%. But this gain of 5% is going to be shared between three parties now. One is your dealer, who is going to get 1%. Other is X and Y. Now obviously the ratio that we have set is 3:1. So out of this 5%, they are going to share in 3:1. So the gain to X should be 3% and to Y should be 1%. Okay, so if I consider that, let's see what should be the rate of interest if borrowed on own. If borrowed on own, what should be the rate of interest? Because we want to say, since X has an advantage of 8% as compared to Y, floating rate wise, if you would have borrowed, that would have cost it m plus 4%. So let's say this is rate of borrowing. Here this would have been m plus 4%, and for y, if it would have borrowed at a fixed rate, that would have been cost at 10%. That would have cost 10%. So net cost, if I say net cost after swap, obviously the dealer should be having a 1% gain, because there is no borrowing cost for the dealer, because he is just a dealer, he's just going to get the brokerage of that portion. And then for x, the cost should be MIBOR plus 1%, and for y, the cost should be 9%. So let's try to create a diagram to present this particular scenario, where we say we are going to have three parties: the firm X, the firm Y, and the dealer in between. So X would be paying outside something, Y would be paying outside something. Since we said X intends to have a floating rate, X would be paying outside a fixed rate, because anyways X was having an advantage in fixed rate. So X would be paying outside the given rate, which is 8%, whereas Y would be paying outside MIBOR plus 1%. And then they need to exchange their interest obligation so that a swap is properly working in between them. So now coming to simply X says that my cost should be m plus 1%. So it will simply say to the dealer, you refinance this 8% that I'm paying, and in exchange, as we have agreed, my cost should be MIBOR plus 1%. So I will pay you MIBOR plus 1%. Whereas with regards to Y, the dealer, Y will ask to the dealer, hey dealer, listen, my cost should be 9%, so I'm going to pay you 9%, and you finance fully my MIBOR plus 1%. And trust me guys, once this has been formed, this diagram has been formed, you will find that the net cost to each one of them is what we have intended for. And so we say, simply we'll say how much they are paying and how much they are receiving. So X is paying 8%, it is also paying MIBOR plus 1%, and it is receiving 8%. So the net effect is MIBOR plus 1% payment. If you talk in terms of Y is paying MIBOR plus 1%, it is also paying 9%, and it is receiving this MIBOR plus 1%. So the net effect, you will say that Y is paying 9%, and that is what the intended cost was also. Talking of dealer, the dealer is essentially paying 8% and also MIBOR plus 1%. So dealer is paying 8% and also MIBOR plus 1%, whereas the dealer is also receiving 9% and MIBOR plus 1%. That's 9% and MIBOR plus 1%. So net effect, you will find that it is just 1% receipt. So in this way, 1% is the gain that the dealer is earning, and both X and Y are able to borrow at a lower rate than what they would have been able to borrow at. So if you look at it, if X would have borrowed a floating rate, it would have cost him MIBOR plus 4%, but now it is costing it MIBOR plus 1%, and if Y would have borrowed a fixed rate, it would have cost him 10%. Now it is costing just 9%. So as we say, X is having a gain of 3%. X is having a gain of 3%, whereas Y is having a gain of 1%. And the dealer is anyways having 1% commission in between, and we observe that it's in the ratio that was agreed earlier. Fine. So that's how a typical swap is entered into. Let's look at one more example. Suppose there is X, there is Y, there is some fixed rate and a floating rate. So suppose the fixed rate is now 10% for X, 12% for Y. Rate of interest is maybe just make this as 14%. For X it is MIBOR plus 0.5, whereas for Y it is, let's say, MIBOR plus 1.5%. MIBOR plus 1.5%. And now the requirement, I'm just giving you the requirement. The requirement over here is, let's say, X require let's say X require a floating rate and Y require a fixed rate. Now obviously many of you would be thinking, sir, in both the case, fixed rate 10%, floating rate MIBOR plus 0.5%, X is having an advantageous position and Y is always in a disadvantageous position. So X should simply take a floating rate at MIBOR plus 0.5%. And I don't think that there should be any swap gain. But to tell you guys, there is definitely a possibility by which X can borrow at a rate lower than MIBOR plus 0.5%, and Y can even enter into arrangement whereby the cost is going to be, fixed cost is going to be less than 14%. Now, how do we do that? How do we engineer that? We'll see in the next video. So stay tuned for the next video, whereby we'll be tackling this sort of swap problems where one entity is just having the advantageous position, but still a swap can be engineered by which both the entities can gain in their own capacities. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you in the next video.